What if Sophie Ellis-Bextor fronted a groove metal band? This week we'll be discussing how the Nepo baby lead singer of an also-ran Britpop band somehow went on to become one of the UK's more enduring pop stars of the 21st century. We'll also be taking a look at the groove metal scene, the bastard offspring of thrash that helped keep metal alive during the dark days of the alternative rock revolution. All that and more on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hi, my name's Morgan Brown, and every Monday I upload a new What If video, and then on Wednesdays one of these companion videos where I discuss the artists and genres involved in the What If video, and also share a little bit of my creative process. So the idea of the What If videos is that each week I pick a popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which some change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I happen to have to hand in order to bring that alternative version of the song to life. So the song I picked this week was Groove Jet by Spiller featuring Sophie Ellis-Bextor, and I tried to reimagine that as a groove metal song, so if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster. Now, Sophie Ellis-Bextor definitely had a pretty sizable revival of interest in recent years due to her hit Murder on the Dance Floor being featured in that iconic closing sequence of Saltburn, which definitely resulted in a lot of people discovering her. I don't know how many of those people who discovered her from that have delved back into the earlier days of her career and whether any of them will have gone back as far as the stuff she did before her solo career, but that's where I first encountered Sophie Ellis-Bextor, fronting the band The Audience, one of those great band names that's designed to confuse everyone. If you are one of those people who doesn't remember them, they emerged quite late on in the Britpop era of the 1990s. I think first started releasing stuff in 1996, but they had a decent little run for just a few years there. It's actually a six-piece band with a few members who are at least minor UK indie luminaries, but all of the attention was totally focused on the lead singer, who obviously was Sophie Ellis-Bextor, partly because she was very young at the time, I think maybe like 17 when they started releasing singles, but also because it was very quickly reported that she was the child of showbiz luminaries, being as she was the daughter of Robin Baxter, a director of a bunch of TV and music video stuff, but also Janet Ellis, who, for people my age, was surely your favourite Blue Peter presenter back in the 1980s. So, born into the entertainment industry. So yeah, this was before the days when the term Nepo baby actually existed, but there was certainly a bit of that kind of discourse around them from pretty much day one, which, coupled with standard Britpop era sexism, did give them a bit of a rough time in the music press. But they definitely had a few good tunes. The one that I always remember is A Pessimist Is Never Disappointed, which is just a really cracking little pop tune. And they did okay for a little bit, only managed to get one album out, and then, as I say, unfortunately, they'd arrived as the Britpop boom was already kind of on the downward slope. So never made it to that second album, and you kind of wondered whether you'd see anything else of Sophie Ellis-Bextor after that. But pretty soon after the band had split, she had the opportunity to work with Spiller, this Italian DJ. I don't know a great deal about dance music, so I wasn't really paying attention at the time, but I gather his track Groove Jet had already been doing the rounds in the clubs and was well known as like an instrumental dance record. I think it was felt that its commercial potential could be massively increased if they brought in a vocalist to put words and a melody to it and make it a proper pop record rather than just a club record. And Sophie Ellis-Bextor gets the gig to do that. And sure enough, did actually manage to turn this relatively underground dance record into a massive mainstream pop hit with a little help I've only recently discovered from Rob Davis from Mud, who I think contributed a pretty significant part of the chorus hook. I always think it's fantastic that Rob Davis, after being in this ridiculously camp glam band back in the 70s, ended up being one of the most influential pop songwriters of the 2000s. Yeah, so that single completely turned her fortunes around and re-established her in a totally different space from this indie Britpop scene that she'd been known in, and established her as much more of a sort of disco diva kind of figure. And that's really been the niche that she's been most successful in ever since. And she's had her ups and downs in the solo career. I think as the 2000s wore on, there were slightly diminishing returns from the record she was putting out. Still, generally managing to trouble the charts a bit with each album, still touring pretty successfully. But I guess slowed down a little bit, concentrated a bit more on raising a family. Fair enough, as you do. I think the big turnaround that brought her really back into the public eye was a really astute reaction to the COVID pandemic and the lockdowns when she started doing the kitchen disco, where she was just basically putting on concerts from her home with members of the family getting involved and stuff, and just a really kind of daft fun thing that people could enjoy while they were sitting around at home being gloomy during a pandemic, and caught on so well that I think it's since become a radio show, and she's sort of taken it out on the road and done live versions of the kitchen disco at festivals and stuff. And that kind of re-established her for a new era as this sort of beloved entertainer, and she's never quite given up that position ever since. And then, as I say, with the inclusion of Murder on the Dance Floor and Saltburn, that's only just broadened that appeal even further. So yeah, it's funny, I don't know if in 1999, when the audience split up, you'd ever have bet on Sophie Ellis-Bextor having that kind of artistic staying power, but here we are 30 years on from that first The Audience single, and she's still going strong, so, fair play to her, I guess. Meanwhile, while Sophie Ellis-Bextor was getting her start in the music scene, fronting The Audience, elsewhere in music, heavy metal was going through a bit of a difficult spell. The 90s, as I think I've discussed in a few of these other videos, was a pretty tough time for metal. It's kind of a cliche for people to point to Nirvana and go, oh, look, Nevermind came out and that killed metal and then everything changed. Obviously, it wasn't remotely that simple or anything like the sort of overnight transformation that people make out, but it's definitely a fact that the sort of rise of alternative music, spearheaded by that particular Nirvana record, absolutely did change the landscape for heavy rock and metal bands, and some really struggled to adapt. I guess just the arrival of all this relatively down-to-earth, grungy music with this sort of punky, anti-showbiz attitude made a lot of the excesses of 80s metal seem positively ridiculous. So you did find a lot of bands kind of scrambling to distance themselves from that. The discussions around that tend to focus more on kind of the hair metal bands, who were the most obviously over-the-top representatives of that 80s excess. But there was definitely a similar scramble going on in more extreme forms of metal, particularly thrash metal. Around the start of the 90s, as there's a feeling of the tide kind of turning, you do definitely start to see a bunch of bands who have come up through thrash metal really overhauling their sound and distancing themselves from that 80s sound. And you start to hear records emerging that have replaced the sort of blazing speed and the emphasis on technical virtuosity and complex song structures with a much blunter, harder hitting, simpler sound that relies on grooves, hence the term groove metal. So it's still heavy, it's still riff based. The riffs though are generally quite a lot simpler, a lot catchier. So it's still got the power and the palm muted chug of thrash metal, but it's also drawing from elements of other influences to create something distinctly different. So you start to hear much more influence from hardcore punk, especially kind of the New York hardcore sound. That sort of slower, more bruising, tough guy hardcore sound becomes a massive part of this new style of metal. Bad Brains as well, who influenced that wave of New York hardcore, also pretty directly influenced this groove metal thing. Their later 80s records, Eye Against Eye and Quickness, being some of the grooviest metal-leaning hardcore records ever made. Sepultura in particular as well also really drew pretty heavily on a bunch of UK punk stuff and Scandinavian, especially kind of the crust punk scene, a sort of bleak, brutal, political punk sound that you hear from bands like Amoebics and the like. And they also drew heavily on a bunch of post-punk stuff. Killing Joke, you can hear as a real influence in there especially. I guess the bands who adapted most effectively emerged as the front runners in this new trend. As I say, Sepultura I'd have to name as one of those, who had been around in metal for a very long time, starting out as early black metal, proto-death metal kind of band, and then developing into one of the finest thrash bands of that era, before, by Chaos AD, pairing out all the more elaborate bits of their arrangements and just going for sheer mid-tempo brutality. Or Pantera, who kind of started out sort of on the heavy end of hair metal, but by the Cowboys from Hell album have taken a bunch of thrash influences, but again melded those to this driving mid-tempo rhythm section, and with the addition of Phil Anselmo on lead vocals, a much more kind of hardcore derived vocal attack as well. And in short order, other bands follow with variations on this theme. Machine Head, White Zombie, who were also really influential in industrial metal circles as well, just keeping metal alive basically, while alternative rock was kind of taking over that mainstream space. A lot of the older, more established thrash bands took a similar route, although quite often with slightly less success, but it did at least sort of help them to keep going in some form or other. I mean, Anthrax, notably when John Bush took over on lead vocals, moved in a distinctly groove metal direction. Testament as well. Quite a few of those kind of classic 80s thrash bands ended up doing something a bit more along those lines. Even Metallica, who were sort of almost too big to really be affected by that alternative rock sea change in the same way as the others. You can definitely see on the Black Album they were aware of this shift, and there's stuff on there that absolutely sounds consistent with this sort of new groove metal sound. Something like Sad But True, that sort of trudging, heavy riff, much simpler, kind of catchy groove with a bit of a monstrously heavy, bluesy, hard rock feel to it, rather than just straight up thrashy metal. And that generation of bands really laid a lot of the important groundwork for the next generation of metal, which of course was new metal, which then brought metal music screaming back into the mainstream. A lot of the foundation of that music is there in those early groove metal bands. They just kind of added in a few more diverse elements from the alternative metal of Faith No More with its kind of funkier touches, and the crossover rap of the likes of Rage Against the Machine, but an awful lot of the rhythmic attack and the weight of new metal you can totally trace as a direct evolution from these groove metal bands. And despite the fact that this evolved style became the mainstream norm, the groove metal thing has never really gone away. There have been successive generations after that. Lamb of God, who emerged around the start of the 2000s, brought a pretty raw return to straight up groove metal without a lot of the bells and whistles of new metal, and have continued to be a massive part of the metal scene. And then Five Finger Death Punch, Bad Wolves, all these bands that have sprung up in the years since have just kind of kept that sound alive, and it continues to be really popular. For me, I never really kept track of it. A little of that goes quite a long way. I tend to prefer my thrash metal to be actual fast thrash, and I tend to prefer my hardcore to be actual hardcore punk, rather than the two sort of blended together. But I'm glad it still exists for those people who want it, and I'm certainly never going to overlook the importance of that genre in keeping metal alive when there's a pretty dark time for metalheads back in the 90s there. But yeah, anyway, that takes me up to this week's alternative universe scenario. So in my alternate timeline this week is the year 2000. So Sophie Ellis-Bextor's in a bit of a funk after the audience has split up. She's been trying to figure out what to do with herself. She's tried embarking on a couple of new projects, including trying to write a song with Spiller, but hasn't worked out. And she's not really sure what she's going to do. Is her music career over? She's feeling very angry and frustrated with how things are going. So she's sitting up late at night, just flicking through late night music TV, not really paying attention, but then just one video catches her eye and she can't look away. It's this gritty, grainy, black and white video, and then the song that accompanies it is just crushingly powerful, raw, and it turns out when she sees the credits come up at the end, it's Black Label by Lamb of God, and that's the first groove metal song that she's ever heard, and she's an instant convert, so she decides enough with Britpop, enough with attempting to break into dance music. She's going to be a groove metaler, so she recruits some musicians from the local thrash thrash metal and hardcore punk scenes, forms a band which he calls Bextor, and they quickly set to work on writing songs for a debut album. Initially, critics are a little bit sceptical about them. They question whether Sophie Ellis-Bextor can ever really have any credibility as a metal artist, but once the lead single from the album, Groove Jet, comes out, metal fans are captivated by the blend of these crushing riffs with this cool poppy vocal kind of drifting over the top of it, and it immediately becomes a groove metal anthem. So, in trying to convert Groove Jet into groove metal, the pun of course being the only reason why I did this in the first place, my first step as ever was just to get the isolated vocal, drop it into GarageBand, sync it up to the grid. Once that was on there, the next thing was adding some drums. So, picked the heaviest drum kit I could find on GarageBand and went for big, solid, chunky mid-tempo patterns. There's a sort of almost tribal sounding groove on the toms in the verse, and then it kind of opens up a little bit into the chorus. Really hard hitting, some bits of proper metal double kick, but not too much. I didn't want it to sound thrash. We're definitely going for that slightly looser, slightly more open groove metal thing. Next thing was bass. Now, the song's in the key of A, which, you know, it's a good guitar key, but this being like pretty heavy metal, you want it to be low. If you play it in A in standard tuning, it's not going to have that low tuned weight to it. So I figured I was going to have to down tune. I don't want to down tune my E all the way to A because that's going to be unusable. The string is going to be far too loose. So I think what I ended up doing was tuning down to B, still quite a lot of steps, but then pitch shifting the guitars and the bass down the last two steps using GarageBand's pitch shifting software. So there's still a bit of floppiness of the strings which causes some pitching issues, but it was the best I could do. So popped some bass on there, really sort of filthy, gritty, sludgy sound. Nothing terribly clever, it's just either doubling the guitar riff or locking in with the kick drum to try and make everything as hard hitting as possible. Once that was done, next thing was guitars, which are obviously going to be the main focus of the music here. So, rhythm guitars. I initially put just a stereo pair on, panned hard left and right, which is what I'd normally do. Came up with a riff that, because I was worried about the pitching from being tuned too loosely, made use of a bunch of bent strings and microtones to minimise the effect of that, which I thought sounded pretty cool. So, put a couple of guitars on doing that. It sounded good, but it still didn't quite have the weight that I wanted. And I've heard metal producers talking about piling up more and more tracks of guitars, you know, quad tracking. So I thought, well, maybe it's time for me to do some quad tracking. So stuck another two guitars on, essentially playing the exact same thing, slightly different sounds. I think the first pair are a bit more mid-scoop. They're emphasizing the highs and lows a bit more. And then the second pair have quite a bit more mid-range. So it just kind of fills out the sound with those in too. And I dropped the second pair out occasionally just for a bit more dynamic contrast. And that sounded pretty cool, but I still wanted a few more bits. I wanted something to lift the chorus a little bit. So the next standard thing that I always do on these things is just some octaves, which provides a different guitar texture, can add a little bit of harmony. Didn't want too much harmony because we're just going for brute force really, but I thought for the chorus, maybe a little octave harmony over the top would be cool. So popped some of that on. For a final guitar track, so the sixth guitar track, I thought just a little bit of lead. During that groove metal era, some bands distanced themselves a little bit from more traditional heavy metal guitar playing, so there's a few less shreddy leads, but I thought Dimebag in Pantera was always still dishing out tasty leads, so I thought I'd try and bring a little bit of that flavour to the things. So a bit of a lead break in the middle, wah-wah pedal, not a massive solo, but it just adds a bit more kind of spiky attitude to the whole thing as well, I think. Then for the video, as ever, started out by finding some performance footage of Sophie Ellis-Bextor back pretty much in the day performing it. I think it's from maybe a T4 roadshow or something, so outdoor festival-ish setting, which is something I wanted because I decided for a backing band I was going to use some footage of Sepultura from Donington Festival. I tried as much as I could to edit it so it looked a bit like they were actually the backing band on the stage behind her when she's out on that walkway through the crowd. And then just as a final touch to place Sophie's groove metal band in that scene, just mocked up a few concert posters as well, just placing them on bills with the kind of bands that a groove metal band of that era ought to have been playing with. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this one. As I say, it was only really the pun of doing Groove Jet as groove metal that attracted me to this idea, but it's a catchy song. You can't deny Groove Jet's excellence as a pop banger, I think, and I've always quite enjoyed the sort of fun contrast of really light poppy vocals over really crunching kind of horrible metal. And yeah, I've always had a bit of a soft spot for Sophie Ellis-Bextor, I guess partly just because when I was a teenager reading the NME, she was like someone who was my age, who was in a band that was in the NME, and I thought that was kind of cool. So I've always rooted for her a little bit, even if most of the music she's done isn't particularly my cup of tea. And at the same time, as I say, I did like some of that groove metal stuff back in the day. I'm not particularly proud of owning a Pantera record or two these days, but that was a significant part of my teenage listening habits, and it was good fun to revisit that and just try and recreate that sound. So I hope you had as much fun as I did. If you did enjoy it, do let me know down in the comments, and if you could like, share, subscribe, all that stuff is massively helpful. If there's anything you'd like me to do in coming weeks and months, any artists or songs or genres you'd like me to investigate, I'm always open to your suggestions. Otherwise, that's all from me for this week, so thanks very much indeed for watching, and I'll hope to see you next time.